The Honourable Trevor Khan.
Could I say at the outset that clearly the matters that were dealt with by the committee were matters of the utmost importance, and of course they involved a number of themes, recurring themes that we've seen the subject of previous inquiry and indeed the subject of discussion in this place from time to time. The extent of the problem in New South Wales is enormous, and we see day in and day out the enormity of the problem in how it impacts upon people day in and day out. And it became very clear early on that when one was discussing affordable housing, that essentially there was no simple solution. There was no silver bullet that the inquiry was capable of coming up that was going to in some way solve a problem which is a reflection, at least in part, of the failure of government, putting aside as much as one can politics, the failure of government over a lengthy period of time to in fact address a number of important issues. Let us take by way of example what has become, in a sense, a catchphrase, and that is the provision of affordable housing, if we could describe it this way, for key workers. What became very clear to the committee was that it is impossible to segment one or two sectors of the community or one or two sectors of the workforce and say they are key workers. Look, there's no doubt that we need our police officers and our nurses and our teachers close to the place of their work. But what one can't do is construct a strategy that identifies accommodation for nurses, teachers, and police officers and ignores the hairdresser, the shop attendant and those who work as waiters and bar staff and the like. Indeed, some of those people need to be close to their work because of similar issues to nurses and police officers, that is, the hours which they work, and also because of the very low rates of pay that they receive. If what we do is, if we construct a strategy on the big government approach of simply fixing part of the problem, that is, putting our nurses close to hospitals, for instance, then what we in fact do is create a form of apartheid and ignore large parts of our workforce. That is a failure and shortcoming on our part if that's the way we seek to proceed. And of course what we also saw in the course of the report was the fundamental problem that it is not just an issue of providing affordable housing if we could, that what we needed to do was to provide affordable housing in circumstances where it provided an opportunity for people to have access to all the other services. And of course what that throws up, and again, wishing to avoid in any way being political in this matter, but it throws up the very shortcomings in terms of the provision of public transport throughout, for instance, the City of Sydney, or indeed we could look at Wollongong or Newcastle or so many other places. Indeed, as the Honourable Mick Veitch, I'm sure, would agree with me, Tamworth. These are circumstances where, at the end of the day, simply the provision of bricks and mortar without anything more. And I just heard the Honourable Robin Parker make reference to Maitland, which is well known, as she's pointed out to me on various occasions, for the failure of adequate provision of services such as public transport, an issue with which is very close to her heart and constantly is a subject of representation by members of the public in the Maitland area, having to go to the Honourable Robin Parker for assistance rather than an absent local member. But I digress. I must go on. Could I observe?
Defending the indefensible and he's going back to being a prosecutor.
Yes. I'm still wondering how he's going to do that. But anyway, could I just go on? There was one interesting model, and of course one that throughout this report is endorsed, and that is the very interesting model of community housing presented by City West Housing. The evidence that was provided by representatives of that organisation was compelling. It was compelling not only because of the way in which the evidence was presented, but the very substance of the evidence that they presented. What they showed was a demonstration that a relatively small organisation which is focused on outcomes, particularly when coupled with with a significant degree of humanity and also technical expertise is in its governance, as the Honourable Mick Veitch interjects. They are able to provide a model for the provision of housing which plainly has not been capable of being provided by any other model, or indeed relatively few organisations in New South Wales. It plainly forms a template for many other organisations that one would hope to see spring up across the state in the light of the bill that the Honourable Mick Veitch so ably introduced only yesterday. Could I observe, of course, that whilst, as is demonstrated in this report, the devolution of responsibility and management down to a low level is seen as being a model for the future, that at the very time where this committee identifies that as the way forward, and indeed this government, it would seem, identifies that as the way forward by the introduction of the bill, one is living in an environment where planning powers have been taken from our local councils in the very area of public housing, and resulted in considerable distortions in the type of accommodation, the type of housing that is being constructed in many areas throughout this city and throughout this very state. And once again, one only has to go to the city of Maitland to see where public housing is being constructed, which doesn't provide adequate parking, doesn't meet floor space ratios that are anywhere close to what otherwise would be seen as appropriate. And what we are seeing is considerable community disharmony created by that approach. It seems that whilst this government is prepared, and again one would not wish to be political, but whilst this government talks the talk, it is incapable of walking the walk. When it comes time to actually finally attempt to a decision, all process disappears out the window, all capacity to deal with local communities evaporates, and we have a heavy-handed and centralised, clumsy approach adopted. It is regrettable, and again, as time and again the Honourable Robin Parker has said, it leads to problems in local communities which just so easily could be avoided by just a little bit of talk and just a little bit of listening, as the Honourable Robin Parker demonstrates so admirably as she goes about her business of representing the people of Maitland. Now, if I could just move on to two other areas of the report in the short time that we have left. Plainly, what we saw in the evidence that we received was a vital need to look at the provision of accommodation in boarding houses. Now, clearly there was a diversity of opinion with regards to the way forward, but I was impressed by the evidence given by representatives of the City of Sydney, including Ms Clover Moore, and her articulate demonstration of the loss of boarding house accommodation in Sydney and the problems that has with regards to homelessness in this city. It's plainly a matter that needs to be addressed in a compassionate and thoughtful way, if that's possible by this government. Again, without being political. The final area that I should come to is the issue of caravan parks. Plainly, the evidence was rather limited in that area, and I can only say that one would hope that the Minister takes up the recommendation that this be an area of inquiry. Plainly, it does provide affordable housing. Plainly, it does provide crisis accommodation. And the loss of appropriate caravan park or mobile home accommodation can only lead to more homelessness in our society. Plainly, it may not be the best sort of accommodation, but a roof over somebody's head is better than sleeping in the park. I think with those apolitical remarks, I will withdraw at this point in time.